These are the lecture notes for Chapter 8, the nervous system. This is part 1. All right. Doing it again. Okay, here we go. So the learning outcomes describe the anatomical and functional divisions of the nervous system, distinguish between neurons and neuroglia, describe the events involved in the generation and propagation of an action potential or nerve impulse. We will definitely cover the first 3 learning outcomes. Describe the structure of a synapse and explain the process of nerve impulse transmission at a synapse. We probably won't go into that as much because we did cover that in the muscle chapter, previous chapter. We will do learning outcome 8.5, describe the 3 meningeal layers that surround the central nervous system, and discuss the roles of gray and white matter in the spinal cord. Name the major regions of the brain and describe the locations and functions of each. Name the cranial nerves, relate each pair of cranial nerves to its principal functions, and then describe the steps in a reflex arc, the sensory and motor pathways, and the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, the effects of aging, and the interactions between the nervous system and other body systems. So I will try to, again, we won't go over every single thing in this chapter, but I'll try to cover the parts that are going to be emphasized on your next exam. So the first thing we're going to start with is we're going to compare the nervous system and the endocrine system because they both are organ systems that control other body systems. They help to maintain homeostasis and control other body systems. They just do it in different ways. So the nervous system generates responses, which we call action potentials or nerve impulses. They're actually electrical impulses. These responses are fast and brief. In other words, they happen very quickly. They don't last very long. And they can be very specific in their target. Whether it's an organ or a muscle or a gland, they can be very specific in their target. The endocrine system generates responses chemically through the action of hormones. And so these hormones have to travel through the bloodstream. So these responses are slower, but their effects last longer. And they often have more general effects and not just a simple, a single specific target. The nervous system is the most complex organ system for sure. The 3 main functions of the nervous system are to monitor the body's internal and external environments. So monitoring, integrating the sensory information, and this happens in the central nervous system. That means receiving sensory information and then making a decision what to do with it, what responses are going to be generated. And then coordinating those responses, whether they are voluntary or involuntary. This is a very good chart to help you understand the organization of the nervous system. First of all, the central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And it's on this figure, it's colored in white. So the brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system. And what the central nervous system does is information processing, integrating, processing, and coordinating sensory input and motor commands. So receiving information and then determining what to do with it, basically. And the peripheral nervous system is everything that extends out from the central nervous system. So it's going to include nerves, the cranial and the spinal nerves, as well as nervous tissue. And it is divided up, the peripheral or PNS is divided up into the afferent division and the efferent division. Sometimes to make it clear, I say afferent and efferent, but that just to let you know That is incorrect pronunciation. But sometimes I worry that students won't understand afferent and efferent because they sound so much alike. Afferent division is going to be the sensory division, and the efferent is the motor division. Motor means that it's going to deal with responses, and sensory means it's dealing with receiving information. Okay, so in the afferent division, there is the somatic sensory receptors and visceral sensory receptors. Somatic sensory receptors, anytime you see somatic, it's dealing with skeletal muscle, and it's dealing with monitoring the outside world and our position in it. So a lot of times it has to do with information that's going to be related to our skeletal muscle. A lot of times it is touch. You know, a lot of that information is touch, vision, hearing, you know, smell and taste. Visceral sensory receptors monitor internal conditions, like, for example, blood glucose levels, you know, the heart rate, the blood pressure, breathing rate, those kinds of things. The amount of oxygen and carbon dioxide dissolved in our blood. So this is going to be internal conditions. And all this information is sent through the afferent division to the central nervous system. And then the central nervous system determines what's going to happen with that information and what the responses are going to be. So the responses are sent through the efferent division. And we have the somatic nervous system, which has a target of skeletal muscle, and the autonomic nervous system, which is divided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic. Both of these, parasympathetic and sympathetic, affect the same things. They affect smooth muscle of our blood vessels, our digestive tract, our respiratory tract, urinary tract, smooth muscle that lines these, the examples I just listed, cardiac muscle in the heart, glands, and adipose tissue are all affected by the autonomic nervous system, but the parasympathetic and sympathetic just cause different effects. So the parasympathetic division is going to be in control or most active when we are relaxed. The sympathetic is most active when we are nervous or scared, or it's called the fight or flight response. Nervous or scared, or when we're exercising, but this is when we have, you know, a fast heart rate, we sweat, dry mouth. You know, these are some of the conditions that go along with the sympathetic division, you know, being active. So, all right, central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. Make sure you know that. And it integrates and coordinates sensory processing and motor transmission. So just remember, integrates and coordinates. So it's going to receive sensory information, and then it's going to send motor information. Motor information is just like another way to say the efferent division. And it's the location of higher functions like intelligence, memory, and emotion. The peripheral nervous system is everything outside the CNS. So it's going to include the cranial and spinal nerves as well as nervous tissue. Always remember that the afferent division is sensory. It brings information to the central nervous system through receptors. Sorry, I didn't mean to cross through it, but anyway, receptors receive sensory information. And then the efferent division, efferent means motor, and it's going to carry information away from the central nervous system to effectors, which are muscles and glands that respond to motor commands. All right, the somatic nervous system controls skeletal muscle. So just remember somatic, skeletal muscle. And the autonomic nervous system controls the other two types of muscle, and also, so smooth and cardiac muscle, and also glands. And it is divided into the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. Okay, two anatomical divisions of the nervous system are the CNS and the PNS. Number 2, identify the two functional divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Afferent is sensory and efferent is motor. And then what would be the effect of damage to the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system? That we wouldn't be able to detect sensory information. So you can't make a decision on what to do. It would be like, for example, somebody who can't feel pain, or who can't see, or who can't hear, Neural tissue, nervous or neural tissue, includes two types of cells. You need to know these. Neurons are the nerve cells. We also call them nerve cells. And then neuroglia are the support cells that support the neurons. A neuron's general structure, you do need to know this, that is divided into 3 parts. The cell body, just like any cell, it has a cell body with a nucleus and other organelles. And then it has projections called dendrites that receive signals and axons that carry signals away. And the end of the axon is the axon terminal. And we heard about this in the last chapter because the axon terminal is what interacted with the motor end plate of the muscle, and it formed the neuromuscular junction. Okay, and the synapse is the gap between the axon terminal and its target, which in the last chapter, the target was a muscle, but it's not always a muscle. The target can be another nerve, it can be a gland, it can be a skeletal, smooth, or cardiac muscle. But this is what a typical neuron looks like. This one is called a multipolar neuron. You can see the cell body in here contains a nucleus. It contains mitochondria for energy. It contains endoplasmic reticulum. This is the rough ER. And collections of rough ER and ribosomes are called nesal bodies in the neuron. So you may see that term, nesal bodies. That just means they're making a lot of protein. And then this, the cell body, the dendrites are the extensions that from the cell body that receive signals. The axon hillock is where the axon begins. The axon is actually the nerve fiber where nerve impulses are transmitted. It's kind of like an electrical wire. And the axon terminals are the ends of the axon that connect to, in this case, the target is another neuron. It's the cell body of another neuron, but it can be a muscle like we saw in chapter 7. The neuron cell body, just make sure you know it contains all of the organelles that we learned in biology. And nesal bodies are just free ribosomes and rough ER. And you find many of these in what we call gray matter. Gray matter is colored gray because it has a lot of these nesal bodies. And then the most neurons lack centrioles. So what does that mean? Centrioles function in cell division. So most neurons cannot divide, especially central nervous system neurons cannot divide. These are the different types of neurons. Multipolar is what we just looked at. That means there's 2 or more dendrites in a single axon. All motor neurons are multipolar. So the ones that we saw in the previous chapter were motor neurons. And all motor neurons and all the ones within the central nervous system are multipolar. Unipolar means they have the dendrites in the axon are continuous and the cell body is off to one side. This is most sensory neurons are unipolar. Let's look at a picture. If we can find one. Oh, I don't see one. Okay, well, I'll do that later. I'll give you a picture of all the different types of neurons. But the main thing is the cell body is off to one side, and it's like the dendrite and the axon is one long fiber. Okay, bipolar neurons are the least common, but we do see them in special sense organs like the eyes. They have only one dendrite and one axon, and the cell body is between the dendrite and the axon. Okay, so I'll try to get you some pictures of those, or you can look them up. They do have pictures of the different neurons in your reading. Sensory neurons receive information from sensory receptors. Motor neurons carry instructions away from the central nervous system. The target of motor neurons are called effectors. So, for example, in Chapter